This project was initiated through the leadership of Converge Oceania, which Converge is a network of youth ministry organisations. It's a global network. It arose from the Youth Commission of the World Evangelical Alliance. And the local network here in Australia, New Zealand and Oceania, particularly concerned for how we might shape our practice of youth ministry in ways that have been informed by primary research among young people in our local context. And so much of our research is drawing on what's happening in the US and the UK, but to hear what's happening here in Australia is a particular concern. As we begin, it's good for us to publicly acknowledge and to thank our funding partners who have made this project possible, and they're listed on the screen. Young Life Australia, Scripture Union, the Salvation Army, the Lutheran Church of Australia, Veta Youth, the Baptist Churches of New South Wales and the ACT, the Bible Society and Christian Schools Australia. And we want to thank also Dr. David Wang, who's from Fuller Seminary in California, who's extended his support to this project through a project that he's doing on global perspectives on spiritual formation that's been funded by the John Templeton Trust.
So the question that has been driving this research project, as we sort of zoom in on the plan of how we went about researching the experience of young people, and we just need a slight caveat here that we've been particularly exploring the spiritual experiences of young people that have had some point of contact with the Christian tradition. So this is the question that's been driving this research. This is a question that Converge gave us to say, this is what we're seeking to understand. This is what we want to see if we can find some answers to that will support ministry practice with research findings. What are the influences and the influencers that shape young people's experience and understanding of God? And from a research perspective, that is a tricky question, because we have to get some sense of, well, what is their experience of God? What is their spirituality and faith practice? But then what's going on around it? What is shaping it? And perhaps what has been shaping that over time. It's not just a question of what they believe, but how they have come to believe it. Now, the reason for this question is very exciting for us because it's a developmental question. How is it shaped over time? But the reason that's driving this, the reason for this question that has driven this research is, well, what are discipleship implications? If we can listen carefully to the voices of young people as they enunciate what has been going on in their faith journeys, how can we companion young people while developing a constructive and life-giving faith of their own? Now, if we return to this question, what are the influences and influencers that shape young people's experience and understanding of God? You can hear that ecological overlay. How did a young person's faith come to be this way? What has been the shaping influences upon it? And so we've worked to shape our research within this ecological frame. And of course, that's a bit of a challenge because we've got to get them to terms with not only what is a young person's faith, but what's around it, what's been a part of that journey, how has it come to be? And so we're trying to get a sense of all of this, and Graham alluded to the fact before that this is a fairly extensive survey. You're starting to get the picture. It's a fairly extensive survey, and we've tried to make it as fun and interactive as possible, but sometimes we feel like just dorky old men putting memes in surveys to try and make it interesting, but sometimes it's the best that we've got. But not only are we trying to get this as a snapshot, but we're trying to get this over time. And so our research process invites young people to reflect on their journey in childhood, in their early teen years, and then in the present time. And what that enables us to do is begin to get a sense of narrative, begin to get a sense of change over time. And that's been the delight. Listening to young people narrate their stories over time has just been wonderful. And we were at an academic conference where we were laying this out for critical engagement to help us to understand what we didn't know. And basically the response from the academics was, "You're seriously trying to do this?" That in asking young people to narrate their story, I guess it's a bit of a truism to say that the journey of discipleship is never taken just as a smooth upward movement of lower commitment to higher commitment. It's a journey of twists and turns, right? And as we've been engaging with the narratives of young people, it's become quite clear that the overall arc is interesting, but if we just focused on this point here, and then this point at the far end, it's from here to here. Is that just a straight upwards movement? But look at everything that's happened in between. And so actually the interesting moments, the important parts of a person's narrative is not the here to here, but it's all the turns in between, right? It's the turning points and the milestones in a narrative which are so important. And as we've zoomed into these moments in order to analyse these, we've found that actually these are the moments of dissonance. Now, dissonance might not be a familiar word for you, but dissonance is like sandpaper on wood. It's rubbing. It's something that's not quite fit and something changes as a result. When we experience dissonance in our life, it's actually an engine of change. And no change happens in your life without dissonance. There has to be some kind of disruption of your status quo in order to move to somewhere new, some place that's different. And the experience of dissonance is rarely fun, right? It sounds lovely. Dissonance just rolls off the tongue, but actually it feels kind of gross. And for some people, I might say, yes, actually, this is a real challenge to my faith, or I thought I was losing it, or some other kind of negative phrase. So dissonance is ubiquitous. It's the experience of everybody. But really what happens in dissonance, whether this turns out for growing commitment or lessening commitment, really plays out in how well one responds to, is supported through dissonance, and ultimately resolves it. And that's a key area that Graham will speak to in a second. But for now, let's just listen to some of the experiences of dissonance that young people have reported in this study. Being in this particular timing, you can imagine that COVID-19 is a bit of a thing, right? And so as we listen to this, it's terribly objectified, but to keep it anonymity, this is case 12. They do have a name, but you don't get to know it. So case 12 says, ever since COVID, my faith has been rocky. Seeing the world in chaos, wondered how a good God was letting all this happen. Right? Now, the sense of, yeah, that makes sense. I can understand that. There's a lot we can unpack in that. So this is an internalized kind of dissonance. It's raising questions of theodicy. How does a good God allow this kind of things together? Is God still in control? There's an internalized cognitive element to it, but you can also hear the emotion as well. Alongside COVID is questioning and doubt, what you might say is a bit more classic dissonance, the questions that arise as we live in a secular age. And so Respondent 56 says, a few years ago, I did go through some challenges in regard to faith. I stopped wanting to go to church. Going only because I had to, and I really started doubting religion. I worried that I wasn't making the right choice, was not convinced that everything the Bible said was true. Case 92 again, I've doubted and questioned even if God still loved me because I was so unhappy. Can you hear there's an emotional dissonance now? There's an affective sense to that. And Demi responding, I used to have a lot of questions, but now I'm just too scared to ask. If you unpack the rest of her story, you can see that that was a particular poignant moment in the way she described her experience of faith. Mental health has also factored quite bigly in our research. And it's really highly co-located. As mental health is present in a person's life, it's commonly associated with significant struggles in faith. And you can see these particular quotes, particularly during experiences with mental illness. I doubted his presence, but was still accepted his authenticity and power. Can you hear the dissonance? This was going, but this was holding strong, and the two were in a kind of a tension together. Again, a kind of an internal and effective. In case 234, this often leads me to heavily doubting my faith and feeling fraudulent in my complacent actions surrounding my religious practices. What I appreciate about this response is so often young people really struggle to enunciate their faith, but given the opportunity to write, which is a little bit of a hurdle for us getting responses, but giving the chance to write, actually some people can be quite articulate in the way they enunciate what's going on for them. And here it's not just I felt bad, it's that I felt fraudulent, that there wasn't some kind of hypocrisy going on here. So again, a different kind. So the social setting is a huge source of dissonance, both with Christians and non-Christian friends. Some Christian friends they found to be false friends. Some non-Christian friends were incredibly discouraging. In some cases, it's close romantic partners being non-Christians. Sometimes the relationship is the source. Sometimes the way others respond to that is also the source of dissonance. But the social setting just seems to be rife with dissonance. And so often, if the social world is going well, then their faith is going well. If their social world's not going well, then faith's not going well. So there's an interesting co-location of faith and the social environment for young people through this time. And finally, it wouldn't be dissonance without real struggles with gender and sexual identity. The LGBTI question is live and rife for our young people. And so in all these cases, we can see many examples of dissonance, and these being kind of the engine room of faith change and turning points and transitions. But as I mentioned, it's really the response, the individual response and the response of others around that became very determinative of how this played out for them in terms of their faith journey.
COVID, as we've said, has been a theme. But for this young person, COVID is now, again, some sort of threat to the equilibrium of life. But the problem is not so much COVID itself, but the response of the church. It's how the church is responding to COVID, which is the particular experience of destabilisation. What's going on here for them, see this contrast between what they expect of a church that should be, in their words, known for love and kindness, and who are instead becoming known for being angry and opinionated on matters outside of the main Christian message. Mental health just seems to be part of the landscape, but the real dissonance comes in the response from the church. True also in experiences of doubt. Her doubts and questions seem to be combated by a church and where she experienced this as, well, a response of bringing theological truth, but without a sense of sympathy or compassion. You know, perhaps the clearest message that is coming through this data as we read it is that the biggest threat to flourishing faith among our young people, it's not those traditional sort of external threats, the world, the flesh, the devil, but actually it's the internal challenge. It's the church. The church for so many of our young people is the place of dissonance. The people who discourage me from faith the most are Christians. The church has been nothing but a huge disappointment. And this isn't because there is this cohort of young people that are abandoning community for some sort of radical individual path. No, there is a longing. You hear this in case 22. Longing for a genuine faith community experience. As Leslie Newbigin has said, the believing congregation is the only hermeneutic of the gospel. That the one thing that will persuade people to believe the gospel, he says, is a congregation of men and women who believe the gospel and live by the gospel. And that claim is clearly supported in this research for Australian young people. What young people are witnessing of the church and how they're experiencing the church is often the decisive factor in their faith journey. It is true that for many of the young people that we're hearing from, the church has been a turn-off for them. But the church can also be a community that holds young people. Consider this expression of doubt. Case 33 uses language of doubt, but it seems to be resolved fairly quickly. I doubted Christ during my early teen years because I didn't like sticking to the strict life of faith. Today I realise how silly I was. Now I have a steadfast faith. Of course, it's typed, so we don't have the sing-song sort of expression, but it's sort of hard to resist. It's sort of, I read this and I wonder about the real depth of that experience of doubts, and I wonder about the depth of commitment that has followed. Contrast that with case 56. Here we have a young woman whose dissonant experience of doubt has actually driven her more deeply into the life of faith. And that step of faith change has come for her through the holding environment of the church. She has come to a point through the fellowship of the church to recognise that doubt need not be something that drives her away, but part of the landscape of faith, which she's finding resources to be able to navigate. We see this also in Andrew's story. A young man came out as gay, but found his church community to be a place of support, even a second family. Now, from what we can tell from reading the rest of Andrew's story, what he says about this spiritual community, it's pretty clear that this is not a community that is sort of notably theologically progressive on issues of sexuality, quite the contrary. Yet there's a quality of care that this young man has found that has kept him connected, not just to the church, but connected to God. There is something deeply moving for me about hearing how these young people are speaking about the challenges of faith, deeply challenging about what they're saying to us, the adult church, and also something really beautiful about the ways that adults have come alongside young people and accompanied them through these years of challenge. So what I want to conclude with in this brief journey is to stand back and to share just three broader reflections. Three things about discipling young people that have emerged for me and for us in conversation as a result of this work. And the first is that to have a better conversation, we need to ask a better question. Connected with the value of a well-put question, my second point is the recognition that young people are asking for the kind of discipleship that would accompany them through a complex journey. We've spoken about the complexity of the faith experience, this ecology of influence. If we listen to these young people, then we'll hear their plea for adults who would join them with a posture of companioning, of listening, of clarifying, rather than one of telling and directing and confronting. To hold the gravity of their questions and to accompany them through it. Our primary aim in this work has been to listen well. And as Rowan said, the church has spent more time talking about young people and to young people and not enough time listening to young people. And we're trying to redress the balance here as we hear what it is that they're saying. But like any good conversation, we listen carefully so that we might respond thoughtfully. And a thoughtful response from the church is going to need to call on all of our theological reflection and resources as we think about how to frame a careful and effective, faithful ministry. But let me conclude with just one deep and clear theological conviction. And that is that young people, created in the image of God, have voices that must be heard. There's the link to our project. We would love you to get involved. We would love you to invite young people to come and share their story so that we might hear more, so that we might be able to respond with greater wisdom.